Hello, everybody. I've been speaking on this podium for the whole weekend, and now for this event. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. This is yet another feminist circle organized by the Asfari Institute, and organized not for the first time by our wonderful colleague Paola Salwan, but for the first time with Paola as our senior international fellow. So this is a welcome event in your new capacity, Paola. We're very grateful that you've put together such an amazing panel. And so this event is, of course, hybrid. It's being recorded and it's been transmitted. It's been live streamed. Is that correct? That's the correct word? Being live streamed on Facebook. I just want to clarify a little bit why is this subject important to us. And as we engage as Asfari Institute in civil society and movements for change and transformation, and particularly with intersectional feminist groups, we usually use existing mechanisms for advocacy and for change. And the most common mechanisms we use are CEDAW, UPR, and other existing mechanisms that Paola is very, very familiar with. However, I think it's about time to look outside the box and to think about the importance of foreign feminist policies and the ways in which these can become user-friendly with feminist civil society in the MENA region specifically. With other tools like CEDAW, etc., we use them to hold our governments accountable. I think the interesting shift that we would like to explore right now is how do we use them to hold governments from the north accountable to what they say they will do, which is supporting feminist movements and feminist, transformative feminist societies everywhere. And normally, these feminist policies have been marketed as being tools from the north, but actually we do have with us Mexico, and I want to welcome our dear friend, Ambassador Jose Madragos from the Mexican ambassador to Lebanon, looking particularly at Mexico's foreign feminist policy and how can, first of all, can we think about having our own feminist policies, and then again, how do we use as feminist groups from the region using the existing feminist policies? I'm going to leave it to Paola in Paola's able hands to start this panel and kick off the conversation. Thank you, Paola.
So as Lina has mentioned, my name is Paola Salwan. I'm the Associate Director for Global Advocacy at the Center for Reproductive Rights based in Geneva, and now I'm a Senior International Fellow with the Asfari Institute. And today, the topic of feminist foreign policies has been discussed in feminist circles for a while now, ever since countries like Canada, Sweden, and France have been implementing them. And for a long time, we have heard the argument that feminism is an import from the West and from the global North. But actually, that myth needs to be debunked because global South countries such as Mexico are also centering feminist principles within their foreign policies. And these policies have been centering gender equality, the protection and the support of women human rights defenders and feminist movements at the core of their policies, and an analysis of intersectional discrimination, including in multilateral spaces. But beyond frameworks and commitments, these feminist foreign policies are also a formal recognition that women and girls experience certain types of human rights violations and are disproportionately impacted by certain types of crisis as well. And that if we're looking at dismantling patriarchy itself, until we do so, and until the revolution comes, remedial action, accountability, and increased resources are needed as a form of reparations. We are in the context of global backlash. I know there's a lot of conversation around that term, backlash against women's rights and feminism. But we are, for lack of a better word, we are in the middle of a backlash against women, against the rights of women, but also of other marginalized communities. And a serious commitment from states towards the support of these groups is desperately needed. So the aim of our event today is to discuss how feminist foreign policies in various contexts have been designed, implemented, to what results, to what impacts, and it would also be great to hear from our panelists and from the audience their recommendations and suggestions to keep improving them. So it is therefore my great pleasure to welcome our panelists today, starting with Sylvie Michaud. She is the second secretary in the political section at the Embassy of Canada in Lebanon. Sylvie, could you kindly share with us Canada's experience in implementing Canada's feminist foreign policy and commitment to gender equality at the regional and national levels? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paola, for this introduction. Distinguished panelists, dear guests, first allow me to say how honored I am to be here. I see this as a learning opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your views on how feminist foreign policies can be strengthened. I was also pleased to learn that my Mexican colleagues and the Ambassador of Mexico would be here today. Before being posted to Lebanon, I worked on Canada-Mexico relations. In 2018, I saw Mexico achieve gender parity in Congress, and in 2020, I witnessed its adoption of a feminist foreign policy. There's no question that Mexico has set a high standard for us in this regard. As for Canada, it has been implementing a feminist foreign policy since 2016. Canada's feminist foreign policy seeks to be inclusive, intersectional, transformative, and grounded in human rights. It takes into account the diverse experiences of women, men, and non-binary people, facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and exclusion, like income, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender expression, language, ability, and age. This allows us to be more responsive to systemic inequalities, specific needs and circumstances, and to avoid unintentional harm. Our feminist foreign policy is also cross-cutting. It applies across all of our international efforts, including diplomacy, trade, security, development, and consular services. Canada's approach seeks to be context-sensitive and based on partnerships. Our efforts are informed by the perspectives of affected individuals, sensitive to local contexts, and based on inclusive partnerships. Finally, we are committed to an evidence-based approach. We use disaggregated data to understand and address the root causes of discrimination and barriers to inclusion affecting people with intersecting identities. This approach comes from a place of humility. Canada is very aware that we too face our challenges and that much work remains to be done to address systemic inequalities, racism, and discrimination, including for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So what does this mean in practice? Since 2016, the Canadian government has issued a series of sectoral policies and initiatives advancing our feminist agenda, notably our Feminist International Assistance Policy and our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, both of which are reflected in our Middle East engagement strategy. In implementing its Feminist International Assistance Policy, Canada has prioritized the investments, partnerships, and advocacy efforts that have the greatest potential to close gender gaps, eliminate barriers to gender equality, and help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As a result, Canada is now the top OECD-ranked donor for the share of its aid supporting gender equality. In 2021 to 2022, 99% of Canada's bilateral international development assistance either targeted or integrated gender equality results. Under this policy, Canada has also established itself as a lead donor globally, supporting comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, addressing inequalities in unpaid and paid care work, and strengthening women's rights organizations and feminist movements. On that note, Canada's Minister of International Development, Harjit Sajjan, announced an increase in funding to the Women's Voice and Leadership Program just last month. Canada will spend $195 million over 5 years and $43 million every year after that to help women's rights organizations that are focused on gender equality. Through this program, and in partnership with Oxfam, Canada is building capacities of local organizations in Lebanon and in the region. On a smaller scale, we support projects implemented by Lebanese civil society through the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. In every case, we ask partners to ensure that women and girls represent at least 50% of beneficiaries. Our partners, whose projects might focus on women's political participation, sexual and reproductive health, or gender-based violence, often exceed that target. As co-chair of the Gender Donor Coordination Group in Lebanon, Canada often encourages local and international partners to consider issues from a gender perspective. Unfortunately, we are too often met with resistance. We are told, and I'm sure you've heard this also, that Lebanon has other pressing concerns and that gender equality is just not a priority. But it's our firm belief that now is exactly the right time to ask these questions because women can be and are powerful agents of change. This is why we spend much of our time conducting advocacy, another key component of a successful feminist foreign policy. At the regional level, we convene FemParl, an annual conference which brings together women leaders from across the Middle East and North Africa region to promote women's participation in decision-making roles. Also at the regional level, our development assistance is responding to economic crises by fostering entrepreneurship, skills development, and job generation, particularly for women and youth. Canada co-founded the Mashrek Gender Facility together with Norway to support the implementation of national action plans for women's economic empowerment in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Let me close by looking ahead. While we celebrate the progress made, we are very mindful of all that remains to be done, not least due to serious backlash against the advancement of gender equality, women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and LGBTQI+ rights around the world, and continued systemic discrimination against racialized communities in many countries, including our own. For this and so many other reasons, the time is ripe for reinvigorated global leadership and action so that we can work together to advance human rights, gender equality, inclusion, and respect for diversity in all of our work, at home and abroad, and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Canada is proud to work alongside like-minded partners as they advance feminist foreign policy objectives, and we look forward to our continued collaboration with all those who share a commitment to a more peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvie, for highlighting Canada's experience implementing its feminist foreign policy, and also for highlighting the resistance that you're meeting in Lebanon and in other contexts. Unfortunately, this is an argument that we're hearing quite often. And so from Canada on to Mexico, which has been pursuing a feminist foreign policy since January 2020. And I'm very happy to welcome our first panelist, who is Alondra Mendoza Carlos. Alondra, you are the coordinator of the Human Rights Team at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the United Nations Office in Geneva. And in that role, you have been at the forefront of implementing Mexico's feminist foreign policy at the multilateral level. Could you please highlight how you have prioritized gender equality, feminist principles, and the reduction and elimination of structural discrimination in multilateral spaces, especially in the context of rising conservatism? Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. I would like to start thanking the Asfari Institute for inviting Mexico to join this highly relevant conversation. It is an honor for us to have this opportunity to share our experience implementing a feminist foreign policy, and thank you to the ambassador for being here with us today. We also think it is very important to learn from other countries' achievements and challenges while doing so, and of course having a better insight on civil society and academia's concerns and priorities when working on these common goals. Mexico has had a long-standing commitment with women and girls' rights and has promoted a progressive agenda to achieve substantive gender equality in all UN fora and international organizations. My country hosted the first World Conference in Women in 1975, where the first multilateral guidelines on gender equality and full participation of women in development and peace were established. Since then, Mexico has had a proactive role, including its participation at the very emblematic Beijing conference in 1995, where the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was adopted, and subsequently in all its review conferences. Gradually, a tradition has been built, and Mexico has made of gender equality one of its central objectives. In line with this, the government of Mexico decided 4 years ago to adopt a feminist foreign policy. We were the first country in the Global South to pledge for such an initiative that aimed at combating structural inequalities and eliminating all forms of discrimination with an intersectional approach. When it comes to the priorities of the Mexican feminist foreign policy, I would like to start by saying that Mexico's main incentive is precisely recognizing the diverse challenges that we have at the national level. We truly believe in a two-way process, and this means that where political willingness translates into the promotion of ambitious global standards, then those standards can contribute guiding the efforts of decision makers and all stakeholders at the national level. Having said this, I will move on to explain the main lines of action of our feminist foreign policy. The first would be promoting initiatives at the international level to advance the gender equality agenda. This means incorporating a gender perspective and intersectionality approach in every area of our foreign policy, including, for example, the development of treaty law, bilateral agreements, the creation of spaces for fruitful exchanges with all stakeholders, and promoting also non-binding initiatives aiming at advancing international standards. An example of what I just mentioned is Mexico's work in multilateral fora, and I will refer specifically to the Human Rights Council. Mexico's flagship initiative is the resolution on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and girls. Last time it was presented, that was June last year, the main topic was young women's and girls' activism and meaningful participation in all spheres of public life, which we consider a central issue to achieve just and inclusive societies. But even when we can think about this as a very elementary topic in terms of gender equality, it was highly contested by a number of countries which still hesitate about its pertinence. Sometimes it is based on their values themselves, but sometimes it's also based on misinformation, misguidance, and others are solely due to geopolitical motivations. So for it to be successfully adopted, it required the core group promoting the resolution to have a frank, open, and constructive dialogue with all countries and stakeholders, but also a very well-coordinated advocacy. I have to say that one of the key elements along the planning and negotiation process of every initiative has been the close collaboration with civil society organizations and with UN agencies. Their support has been crucial to create a better understanding, not only about the topics, concepts, and language that we use in the resolution, but about its real impact for the work done on the ground. Mexico is also one of the main sponsors of the resolution on the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, which we consider a landmark initiative, since it opened a discussion on a pressing topic that demanded the international community to raise its voice. When it comes to proactively creating spaces, one of the best examples on this has been the Generation Equality Forum, which Mexico co-hosted with France in 2021. As a result, accountability mechanisms on gender issues have been established to monitor progress on the delivery of commitments, but also to generate data for analysis. The forum also showcased the crucial role of young women and girls activists, and also how feminist solidarity can create real and transformative changes. As a result, we have another line of action of the feminist foreign policy that is mainly related to the women, peace, and security agenda. We are convinced that exclusion and inequality are not only root causes, but also aggravating factors in conflict situations. So we must invest in sustaining peace by promoting gender equality. In 2021, Mexico presented its first national action plan to follow up on the Security Council Resolution 1325. As part of the action plan, we are working on increasing the deployment of women in peace operations and also taking concrete actions to implement the Women Peace Builders program with the support of UN Women. During its term as UN Security Council, Mexico also co-chaired with Ireland the informal expert group on women, peace, and security, pushing to fully incorporate the topic across all thematic and country files of the Council. Moving to another space of influence, Mexico has called to mainstream a gender perspective in the climate change discussions. At the UN Climate Change Conference back in 2019, Mexico pushed for an enhanced version of the Lima Work Program on gender. And during the last COP, that was COP27, we presented a national action plan for gender and climate change. Another main axis of the Mexican feminist foreign policy is to strengthen the legal framework through the ratification of legally binding instruments that touch upon gender issues from different perspectives and also different areas of work. This is why, during the last 3 years, we ratified the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment, the ILO Domestic Workers Convention, and at the regional level, the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. Another course for action has been the promotion of women candidacies for international bodies and organizations. Mexico has promoted women candidates to International Court of Justice, the United Nations Joint Inspection Unit, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Committee on Persons with Disabilities, just to mention some of them. Another priority point in our feminist foreign policy would be the internal structure of the ministry. The consistency of the foreign policy also relies on changes within our own organization. So that is why measures should be taken to achieve gender parity, and a series of institutional and legal strategies have to be implemented to eradicate structural differences. Finally, I would like to conclude the presentation reflecting on the way forward. We have been witnessing backlash, as you already mentioned, at the international fora, but also regressive measures are being implemented at the national level in different countries from diverse regions. In this context, it is important to strengthen our efforts and improve our coordination, not only to defend what has been achieved during the last decades, but to have the standards being progressive. And it must be done by addressing first the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, also ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, taking all measures to guarantee the effective and meaningful participation of all women and girls in all spheres of life, and adopting effective policies to eliminate gender-based discrimination and violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alondra, and thank you for highlighting the role of CSOs as a civil society organization also based in Geneva. I think it's time that we thank Mexico for involving us so closely in the discrimination against women and girls resolution and in other initiatives. It has been a partnership that I think has worked quite well. And you finished your presentation with literally all of the terms that are problematic and are facing backlash at the moment. So thank you for highlighting them and reminding us that we will still be having to fight for them. As Mexico and Canada have been experimenting with the feminist foreign policy for years, other countries such as Germany are just starting their adventure on the feminist foreign policy path. And this is the case of Germany, and I'm pleased to welcome Katia Schnellecke. I'm very, very sorry if I'm butchering your name. Usually it's the other way around. Katia is the policy advisor for gender justice and feminism at the Department for Global and European Politics at FES in Berlin. Katia is joining us online, and she will discuss the genesis of the German feminist foreign and development policy and Germany's guidelines for feminist foreign policy and its strategy for feminist development policy. Thank you, Katia.
Thank you very much, Paola, for the invitation, and you pronounced my name perfectly fine. I'm especially happy to be here because I actually spent the last 4 years in Beirut as our director of the Regional Gender Feminism Office of FAS in Beirut. So I'm very pleased to be able to virtually join you. And I just briefly want to clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of the German government, but rather in my role as policy advisor working for a German political foundation and as an external observer. And because I'm a super fast speaker usually and in a bit of a rush, I prepared a little presentation just for everyone to follow up in case there are open questions. And we can dive right into the next slide. Thank you. So I'm just trying to outline where we're coming from and where Germany is at now, and also highlight at the end a few challenges, because I think that might be helpful for the further discussion where civil society and women's rights organizations can hold the global north accountable. So Germany is currently ruled by a three-party coalition since 2021. With the Social Democratic Party holding the majority, and our Chancellor Olaf Scholz is actually referring to himself as a feminist, and he's ruling together with the Green Party and the Liberal Party. So I think that already gives quite a hint as to why a feminist foreign and development policy was possible in that political climate for Germany at this time. So the commitment for a feminist foreign policy was already stated in the government's coalition agreement, and just about 2 months ago, at the 1st of March of this year, 2 ministries actually launched 2 documents. So we now have a feminist development policy strategy by the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as a set of guidelines defining a feminist foreign policy by the Federal Foreign Office. Both documents have been prepared with consultation with experts in civil society, and especially the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development made a very big effort to include partners from the Global South. Both are based on a 3R, on the 3R approach of Sweden, with the little extra edit of diversity. So very straight from the beginning, both ministries said we do not want to reinvent the wheel, but we want to build on what's already out there and what others already work with successfully. And yes, thank you. I'll give you a little outline on the guidelines for feminist foreign policy. So they actually start by highlighting that women's rights are a barometer of the state that societies are in, which I think is quite helpful to understand the next steps. So as I mentioned before, they aim to implement a feminist foreign policy with a focus on women and marginalized groups' rights, representation and adequate resources, so the 3R, and they should cut across all areas of activity of the Foreign Office. There's a clear commitment to increase funding. So by 2025, 85% of the projects should be developed and funded on a gender sensitive basis, so GG1, and 8% should be supported on a gender transformative basis, which is GG2. And the guidelines that have been developed provide both context and impetus for action to the Foreign Office within, but also outside the Foreign Office. So the first 6 guidelines, which you can see on the slide, are focusing on external policy making. Just to name a few examples, so for example, in the sphere of peace and security policy, the focus is a lot on participation of women and marginalized groups in peace processes. For humanitarian assistance and crisis management, for example, it's about placing more emphasis on intersectional and gender-specific risks, as Germany already did in the earthquake response in Turkey and Syria as the most recent example. To walk the talk, we already also have 4 guidelines focusing on the internal perspectives. So the only way really for external action to be credible is if they also change the way Germany works within the Foreign Service. So that is why these guidelines address things the Foreign Service can do to strengthen equal opportunity, diversity, and inclusion. Examples would be, for example, offer a job sharing for postings, more support for LGBTIQ+ staff and for people with disabilities, and also training staff members on feminist foreign policy, as well as creating peer learning networks within the ministry. The overall idea is to cultivate a so-called feminist reflex for all diplomats. So the guidelines serve of a purpose of mainstreaming and should influence everything diplomats do in the future in national foreign policy, European policy, or in the international work in the United Nations, for example, and other international fora. So in all field of actions, diplomats are supposed to develop a feminist reflex. That means they apply a feminist approach in all activities, looking at every issues through feminist lens, internally and externally. And among the instruments they're using, I think that's quite, is all very well known to you as the expert community. Feminist development policy has actually a little bit of a different approach. Could you move to the next? Thank you. So they use a lot of focus on an agency narrative that emphasizes the potential of people to act rather than describing women as victims of violence, but as agents of change, what I think is very important. The core assumption here is that gender equality does not simply appear just by chance, but it's the result of certain power structures, discriminatory norms, and role models. So the aim of our feminist development policy strategy is to eliminate structural inequalities, unequal treatment, and discrimination in the long run. It also includes racist structures and power relations. So it has a clear post-colonial, anti-racist, and transformative approach. And it identifies the patriarchy as an issue that we need to dismantle or to overcome, unlike the strategy of the Foreign Office that doesn't mention the patriarchy once. There's also an understanding that feminist development policy enhances the equality for peoples of all gender, thus is of the advantage to the whole society, including men. And I think that's very important when we're explaining feminist development policy to the public, that it really, everyone benefits. The funding guidelines are the same as for the Foreign Office, but in the strategy, the ministry identified 4 areas of action. So again, we have the 3 R's. We learned a lot from Sweden in this regard, but also identify the portfolio level. So the idea is to implement a feminist approach throughout all portfolios, strengthen gender transformative and intersectional approaches, and work very closely with partners in civil societies and implementing agencies. On the multilateral level, the aim is to strengthening feminist development policy within international alliances, so bringing it up with partner governments or in international organizations. And last but not least, also the development ministry takes an inward-looking approach and at the institutional level, so really trying to lead by example, develop their own structures and processes and modes of operation according to a clear feminist development policy. Just to give you a brief outline, the next step is a gender action plan that is to be launched in the second half of 2023 to define main areas of action, concrete aims and activities. And I think this is something where civil society organization especially can step in and advise the ministry of their needs. But the gender action plan also should include a method of monitoring. And I'm really interested to hear what our colleague is going to say about that, how the index for feminist foreign policy can help. Last but not least, just a very brief look on challenges. So I think one of the big challenges here is transformation versus reform. If there are only 8% of funding spent on transformative projects, I'm a bit indecisive how transformative the approach is going to be, or if it's rather going to be pushing for reforms in the current patriarchal system. Also, there is no criticism of the current economic system. We all know that capitalism has it takes a big part in the economic and social exploitation of women and marginalized groups. And only in the feminist development paper strategy, it is mentioned that the issue of women doing the majority of unpaid and underpaid work, that is addressed, but no other criticism of how our economy works and exploits people. Coherence is important, and I'm keen to learn from our other international partners here. We touch upon climate change, on defense, on peace and security. Those are all policy areas that are covered by other ministries. So how can we mainstream together with other ministries? And also just, for your information, in the German parliament, we currently have around 35% of women MPs. So if we really want to walk the talk and be a credible partner, Germany needs to do better also in domestic policies. Communication, accountability, I already touched up on that. Paola, you mentioned the backlash that we're facing internationally, so we really need to explain why we're having a feminist foreign policy and not a human rights-based foreign policy, for example, and ensure that the feminist principles are deeply anchored in parliament and ministerial structures, and to build broad alliances, work with the opposition, so we are not facing the situation of Sweden. If there's a change of government, the feminist foreign policy will be abolished. And last but not least, I just want to put the question out there because I think that's going to be relevant for the discussion. The Russian war against Ukraine sparked a huge discussion in Germany if feminist foreign policy and delivering arms to Ukraine can go hand in hand. Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to have time to look into that in the discussion round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katia. And I think one common thread to the three presentations that we've had so far is the necessity to look within for states. To have a bit of legitimacy, feminist foreign policies really need to interrogate power dynamics that exist within national context before we can actually make recommendations within feminist foreign policies. Our next panelist is my partner in crime. I know he has an official title and everything, but Gabriel Galil is the program coordinator at ILGA World in Geneva, and we've been in the trenches of advocacy together for years now. And we wanted to invite Gabriel for him to get the CSO perspective on what has been the impact of feminist foreign policies in advocacy in multilateral spaces. And so that's my question to you, Gabriel. In your experience as a human rights advocate, how have feminist foreign policies impacted the work of human rights defenders, both at the national but also at the multilateral level, especially on pushing for sexual and reproductive rights? And what would be your recommendations for improvement and strengthening? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thank you to the Asfari Institute for having me here. As Paola mentioned, I work with ILGA, basically doing advocacy at the Human Rights Council and UPR, but the restriction is only on our job titles because we are kind of covering all the fires around different agencies, and that's something I will explore a bit more later. But basically, we see how the feminist foreign policies are impacting the negotiations at multilateral spaces. So that's going to be a bit of my perspective. To start with, it's of course undeniable that these feminist foreign policies have consolidated and have been very important into bringing to the center of human rights discussions issues that until very recently were deemed as secondary, right? Gender and sexuality issues, SRHR, women's participation. And this is, of course, a reflex that these feminist foreign policies were very often built by feminist movements inside those countries to push for their governments to have a more inclusive approach. So I think this is the first point to be said, that it's very important how these policies have helped us to have more spaces in multilateral forums, have pushed this status to have meaningful participation of feminist movements in the decision-making process, to have consultation with civil society working on feminist and queer issues internationally and also domestically. However, I think that there still needs to be said that what we are seeing is this gender mainstreaming, it's important. So we see, for instance, when we are negotiating resolutions in different thematics as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, democracy, we do see a strong gender perspective. So we see more language and we see an effort to bring to the human rights spaces the impact of gender power imbalance and these power dynamics. However, I think that there still need to further this to other spaces that are not the human rights spaces, and especially because when we talk about feminism and when we talk about feminist foreign policy, most of these policies do have on the paper a cross-cutting approach, but when we go to other multilateral spaces that talk about migration, that talk about development, humanitarian assistance, I think there's still this feeling by us, civil society, that our issues are deemed secondary again, and these discussions are technical, these discussions are like hardcore, and that perhaps a gender perspective can be left for a second stage. And I think this is still a major area of improvement, and especially it's a bit short-sighted for, let's put it like that, because actually these areas are areas that will impact very heavily SRHR and all the set of women's rights, right? When we talk about economic, social, and cultural rights, when we talk about migration policies, when you talk about climate change, all these areas have, again, as the most vulnerable population, very often women and girls, LGBTI people, and all the intersections. So I think this is for sure one of the first recommendations to really replicate the efforts that have been made to make human rights spaces more feminist in these other forums, and really see how this is going to boost SRHR, and not just on the books, but really how this changes a lot the implementation. And one thing that when we talk about this invisibilization of these issues in other spaces, sorry, let me just find myself on the, this is why I don't do talking points, because I lose myself. I'm sorry for that. You don't need that. And while I'm here, I'm talking about women and LGBTI as if they're all encompassed by feminist foreign policies. And our colleagues that shared their perspectives also said that most of these policies are inclusive. One consequence of these policies have been that states have been making much more effort to defend the human rights of women and LGBTI people, but these efforts have had perhaps a not so positive consequence, which has been the separation of these two issues. And as Paola mentioned, one of the main challenges that we face currently, it's the backlash against SRHR, against SOGIESC rights, and this backlash does not take into consideration, does not, has the same gap that we have currently between feminist and queer movements. On the contrary, one of the main characteristics of the backlash movement is to explore this gap and to try to further this division and to divide us, to pitch us one against the others, as we have seen, for instance, on fabricated discourses, putting cis women against trans women, disability rights against SRHR, and so on. And I believe that that's something that feminist foreign policies still need to incorporate. It is perhaps a recent trend. I wouldn't say that it's that recent, but I think that we have been paying more attention to it over the last few years. And to us as civil society, it's one of our biggest priorities, and it's perhaps something that feminist foreign policies still need to be updated to really take the anti-rights movement as a serious threat, and to really put this in their policies, not only for negotiations, but also for funding, to providing support, because what we have seen is that while we still have limited capacity to work on that, these organizations have almost unlimited resources compared to feminist and queer organizations, and they are everywhere, while we are, as Paola said, we are partners in crime, because basically the two of us against the rest. So it is an incredible unbalanced relation when we put into comparison the anti-rights movement and the LGBTI and feminist movements. And this is way beyond rhetoric. We have seen legal setbacks. Last year we saw Roe versus Wade being overturned in the US, but also in the area that why I work more, which is LGBTI issues. We have seen this year 5 different African countries having bills to further criminalize consensual same-sex relations. I've seen in European countries very intense disinformation campaigns against trans persons. So it is nothing. It isn't something that we are overreacting. It is a priority that needs to be incorporated and needs to be thought by the feminist foreign policies through human rights negotiations, but also through capacity building, funding, not only international level, but also on the domestic and local level, because this has been the strategy of the anti-rights movement. They have been investing in local litigation, and this was the way that they found to try to do setbacks. We always say that they are very strong, but we are holding the fort, right? We have been, so far we have been managing to defend the normative standards that we have built, but it is a very strong pressure that we are under. I'm not sure where I am on time.
It's okay.
Yeah? Okay. But I wanted to then summarize saying that this is actually one, the main recommendation that I would leave to really, I know that some of these policies have been built when the scenario was different, when we were kind of on the rise of, I mean, we were managing to gain space on international negotiations when we talk about SRHR. And I think that's not the case now. We are actually trying to fight to maintain the space that we have. And a meaningful feminist approach might actually be helpful to build bridges, to see how we don't need to necessarily say that we are being feminist, but still being by when we are defending socioeconomic rights, when we are defending more inclusive migration and refugee policies, and that this has a feminist impact, even if we are not saying that they are feminist. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for also echoing what Alondra was saying around the need to center feminist solidarity. And if I can very quickly build on that, I think that what is really core to feminist foreign policies and their development is to remind ourselves that feminism is a subversive current at its core, with the objective of actually not only like questioning or interrogating power dynamics, but really to dismantling structural systems and patterns of discrimination. And not only do we have a civil society organization to fight against the anti-rights movement, but we also have to kind of fight the instrumentalization of feminism by the mainstream, which is giving us a version of feminism light, you know, like kind of a veneer of what we called feminism that is just kind of empty words behind kind of gender equality, that kind of current of feminism that really is happy to walk hand in hand with the establishment rather than actually dismantling these patterns. Anyone that has worked in this field for a long time knows that we need monitoring and evaluation and the development of indicators to assess where we're at on specific processes. And this is why I'm extremely happy to welcome our final panelist, Foteini Papagioti. Foteini, I'm also very sorry for butchering your name. Foteini is a senior global policy advisor at the International Center for Research on Women. The ICRW has compiled and launched the Feminist Foreign Policy Index, which is a quantitative evaluation of feminist commitments, which is helping us to actually assess feminist foreign policies and their impact on the primarily affected groups and people. Foteini, welcome, and could you please let us know how this index came about and highlight its main findings and recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you, Paola, and also a special thank you to Lina. It's good to see you here. It is exciting to be joining you today to discuss feminist diplomacy, feminist foreign policies, and the FFP index. And I hope today's event is one of many on feminist diplomacy approaches for and also from the Middle East and North Africa region. If we can move on to the next slide, please. At ICRW, we have worked closely with feminists around the world to define FFP as it emerged and started gaining traction around 2017. We have conducted research and also convened experts to develop both a definition that captures all the complexities and nuances that some of the other panelists have also highlighted, and also a framework that adopts a rights-based and intersectional feminist approach. You can find our work on FFP on our website, and I will also later share QR codes that you may use to access the FFP index and the accompanying website. If we stay on the previous slide, please, we can see that it took 7 years for the first 7 countries to adopt some form of feminist diplomacy. But then the next 7 countries joined over a period of just 2 years. And moving on to the next slide, we can see that it is very encouraging. More and more countries are thinking about their own approaches to feminist diplomacy, and that has also led us at ICRW to think more about what this could mean in practice in different contexts. But at the same time, there's a growing critique of countries with FFPs. Sometimes they struggle to strike the right balance between international and domestic commitments to gender equality, or the rhetoric between, commitments to gender equality, but then business and industry practices that may be incompatible with those. We have also had critiques pointing to a rather muted response to recent major challenges to gender equality, for example, in Afghanistan, in Iran, and elsewhere. Also, as other panelists have mentioned, and Paola, you yourself mentioned this also, a gap in accountability. Most of the countries that have adopted a feminist foreign or development policy lack a robust monitoring framework with stated objectives and metrics that also mandates a regular evaluation of progress. So to date, if I'm not mistaken, only France has submitted a monitoring and evaluation report with concrete recommendations for improvement. Sweden was also in the process of developing such a report, but it has not been published. And as we all now know, the new government has abandoned the feminist label and promised, committed to at least continuing with the policies promoting gender equality. So in this context at ICRW, we believe that yes, new announcements are always welcome and encouraging, but at the same time, we need more ambitious policies, more credible commitments backed by concrete benchmarks that will then enable meaningful monitoring of progress. The next slide has the QR codes that I mentioned. If you haven't had a chance to access the index on the website yet, you can do this through the codes. And then moving on to the next slide, the Feminist Foreign Policy Index came out of this broader context as a quantitative framework to address how countries progress toward the uptake of feminist commitments in foreign policy. So we drew these commitments from many multilateral frameworks on gender equality, peace and disarmament, sustainable development, economic and climate justice, and those have been in line with long-standing feminist advocacy. And we developed it as a set of minimum standards, but this builds on a vision of feminist foreign policy that somewhat expands on current approaches. And we were very intentional in the process about broadening the scope to integrate the perspectives from countries from the global south, developing countries, and really aiming to address the structural causes of inequality. So we intended this as a policy tool to facilitate cross-country comparison, quickly look at where your peers are, also strengthen evaluation and accountability, and provide concrete recommendations for policies that can be adopted and inspire action toward transformative change. A note here, important, is that the index is not an evaluation of existing frameworks. As we've heard already, many of the countries that have announced a feminist foreign policy do not have a public document that lays out their vision with clearly articulated goals and metrics. And then we don't have data on implementation or monitoring. So we cannot provide that kind of external review for these processes. So when we get to the final rankings, please remember, they are not interpreted as which country has the best feminist foreign policy plan, but it's mostly about how do the actions these countries take in their foreign and multilateral engagement align or not align with feminist demands against the indicators that we have chosen for each of the priority areas. A little bit on methodology in the next slide. We evaluate 48 countries that are OECD members, candidates for accession, or partners. There are 7 priority areas and 27 indicators in total. Again, not an evaluation of existing FFP frameworks, but we selected the indicators to capture both financial and normative commitments, and also efforts at improving representation, and finally, to measure if and how the countries in the data set may actually be contributing to global inequalities, including gender inequality. And that goes back to issues in the economic system, and others that we will see as we go through each of the priority areas. So we start by evaluating commitments to peace and disarmament. This is a core tenet of feminist activism and is ever more relevant today as we see more and more militarized approaches to security undermine peace, violate human rights, divert funds to armaments and military budgets, and perpetuate women's inclusion from engagement with ongoing peace processes, and also contribute to environmental degradation. So, as an example, according to data that the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute recently released, the global military expenditure reached a new high of almost 2.3 trillion, increasing by 3.7% in real terms in 2022. And although Europe saw the steepest increase in the past 30 years, we know that arms flows to the MENA region over decades, and including experts from many countries with a feminist foreign policy, have fueled conflicts. They have contributed to human rights violations, including gender-based violence. Some of the FFP countries also frame these expenditures as a rational approach to current geopolitics and dynamics, but feminists continue pushing against that narrative, and we demand that priorities shift. And we keep pointing to the fact that a tiny share of global military expenditure would cover financing needs for many of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So clearly there is a need to rethink our priorities and rethink what rational means in this broader discussion. Moving on to the next priority area, we look at official development assistance, one of the main sources of development financing, and a key component of feminist foreign and development policies. So we evaluate commitments to addressing ODA holistically. That means reaching or maintaining the 0.7% of the gross national income goal, increasing gender equality focused aid, and significantly increasing funding for women's rights organizations and feminist movements. Research we conducted last year at ICRW has shown that the announcement of a feminist foreign policy is associated with an increase on gender equality focused financing, but those commitments prove harder to sustain over time. In 2021, Luxembourg, Sweden, Germany met the 0.7% goal, and Spain and France have committed to it, but Sweden recently announced that it will probably be abandoned. And although ODA grew overall in the same period, we know that the funding for gender equality declined. Canada and the Netherlands had the highest shares of gender equality funding. And also funding for women's rights organizations also decreased in the same period. And again, Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden and France emerged as the largest funders in this area. Moving on to priority area number 3, migration for employment. We evaluate commitments to migrant integration and ensuring the well-being of women migrant workers, particularly those providing care services in the home. And indicators for this priority area include the Migrant Integration Policy Index and ratification of ILO conventions on migration for employment and domestic workers. Priority area 4 addresses fundamental labor rights, such as freedom of association and collective bargaining, to improve the status of women in global value chains. And we also urge countries in this priority area, particularly those adopting FFPs, to consider prioritizing ratification of ILO Convention 190 on violence in the world of work, which to date has had a very slow update. At the time of writing the index, none of the FFP countries had ratified it, but Canada, France, Mexico, and Spain had signed it, and it will be fully ratified within the next couple of years. Priority area 6, economic justice. This section discusses trade liberalization, foreign investment, taxation, global taxation, and human rights in the conduct of business. So we know that these key components of the global economy can improve women's economic participation and empowerment, but in their current form and structure, they often contribute to violations of women's rights. They entrench gendered occupational and wage gaps, facilitate tax evasion and profit shifting, and reduce the ability of governments, particularly in developing countries, to generate revenue. There have been some initiatives to develop more equitable and gender-sensitive policies, but those have largely remained voluntary or limited in application, or they haven't been adequately inclusive in their development. So that is why we try to highlight some emerging promising initiatives, such as gender-sensitive trade agreements, investment treaties that address gender equality, and growing support for a global UN tax treaty. So hopefully with sustained advocacy and pressure on these and broader issues like debt and development finance, there is some hope for change in the global financial system. And there are a lot of initiatives ongoing that we look to be involved in this sense. For priority area number 6, we evaluate ratification of CEDAW without reservations, and also women's participation in elected office and appointed positions of leadership, including in parliaments and ministerial level positions. We do know that there's evidence on the positive effect of increased women's participation in politics and governance, but unfortunately, few countries have achieved parity or set ambitious goals for doing so. And this is something that we really want to stress the need for focusing on this area. And then the final priority area, but perhaps one of the most important one, climate justice evaluates commitments to addressing the climate emergency, both as a standalone threat to humanity and for its linkages to all of the other priority areas in this index. And of course, due to pre-existing inequalities and discrimination, women and girls and all their diversity tend to feel and bear the impacts of climate change disproportionately. So here we evaluate carbon dioxide emissions as a share of GDP to highlight that really, no matter what other commitments we take, unless we shift consumption and production patterns, little actual change can happen. Net zero pledges, the integration of gender considerations in adaptation and mitigation plans, the share of women delegates in United Nations framework climate negotiations, and contributions to the Green Climate Fund. And finally, a glimpse of the results with countries ranking in the top 10. Sweden ranks first, indicating that they have a broad, they have broadly integrated gender considerations into their foreign policy. It will be interesting to see how this gets taken forward with the new government. And then we see that we have 4 of the countries that currently have a feminist foreign policy in the top 10. And also, interestingly, countries, 5 countries from Latin America in the top 10. Latin America has a long history of feminist movements and feminist demands and thinking around the global economic system, extractivism, climate. So it will be very interesting to see how these perspectives from the global South get integrated into the broader FFP project and have, you know, hopefully bring in new momentum and new thinking in this area. So after putting together this brief snapshot, I think new directions in this research can build on case studies of specific countries and a more in-depth evaluation of what FFP countries are doing in this space. Some civil society colleagues and partners have been doing this more in-depth and country-specific work. And, you know, we at ICRW would love to collaborate with partners around the world to develop and articulate feminist foreign policy frameworks for different regions. So please do not hesitate to reach out with feedback, comments, ideas. We are open to having those conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Foteini, for highlighting that so many Global South countries, especially from Latin America, are actually at the forefront of the fight for gender equality, and that participates into undoing the myth that feminism and feminist values are an imposition from the West or from the global North. With all of the information that we have received, I'm hoping that there are some questions, either in the room or online, that our panelists can answer.
It's actually in relation to what Gabriel said, that at the end of the day, this is a subversive project. And I want to circle back. I want to circle back to this because you also spoke about the backlash and the backlash in the form of anti-rights movement everywhere. May I just also add that the backlash is also in the form of soft feminism. I think this is at least the backlash, which is in terms of anti-rights. We know how to it's clear, you know, it's there. And there are different ways that the feminist movement everywhere has devised to deal with it. But the soft feminism, the feminism of selfies in elevators and let's have dinners and so on, and how many women on the table and all of this, and that is totally oblivious of systematic changes, that is oblivious of proper analysis of where we are, and which is definitely not intersectional, not inclusive. What is the best, not the best, but what are the most efficient ways or strategies to challenge this? This is the most, you know, the lean-ins and so on is the most attractive form of soft feminism that is incredibly liked and incredibly well-resourced. How, in your experience, what in your experience is the best way to kind of make sure that it doesn't play also an important role in the backlash?
Thank you, Paola, and thank you for posing that question. I think that is one of the main challenges when implementing a feminist foreign policy, like knowing the lines and how effectively implement what are our objectives. It is not easy sometimes to identify where it's being a soft feminist policy and if we are going in the right direction. So I think there are 3 main points. First of all, we should never get separated from our own realities. We should keep touch with everybody that is working on the ground to always have in mind what are the right challenges and then how to better respond to them. We always talk about this gender responsive issue, but sometimes we don't know how to translate it into practical actions. So I think the most important thing is to keep an open, frank dialogue and fluid conversation with all stakeholders working on the ground. And this is civil society organizations, also the UN agencies that are working on the ground, and also looking at our national challenges and see where the main problems are, so we effectively respond. Like, it's not go and promote some language that it's just disconnected to reality, but something that could really translate into changes. The second point, I think it would be to exchange experiences. No one knew in the first time how to plan, design, and then implement a feminist foreign policy. So we are all learning together as we do it in our own countries. The contexts may be different. Our experiences are also diverse. So it is important to keep communication. The Global South, luckily, we are different countries who are that are working on the same issues and goals. So it is important to keep this conversation alive, and also with other contexts and regions that have been leading on these specific issues. And also it is important, what it was mentioned here before, measuring, having accountability mechanisms, so that we know how much progress we have made. Sometimes it is difficult because there are things that are just theoretical, mainly in the multilateral fora, but we have to try to do our best to have somehow some indicator that we are going on the right direction. And from my side, that would be the main 3 points that we have to look into.
Thank you, Alondra. And then, are there any other elements of responses from our colleagues online? Yeah, so we have comments online, but I wanted to, if anyone has a response to Lina, before we move on to the next question.
If I may add, I think everything has been covered, the question has been covered very well. I think we do need to focus on making feminism political again, and also identifying strong policies within the realm of what can be achieved. That can be a constraint many times, but at least it gives us a framework to think about what concrete policies we can propose and we can push for, and how do we make these really transformative, rather than thinking just about representation, which is needed but not sufficient. Thinking one step ahead about what will this representation then try to accomplish? What is the end goal? What true transformative change do we want to bring by bringing in more women into these spaces?
Thank you, Foteini. Gabriel?
Thank you, and thank you, Lina, for the question. I think that when you asked the question, it triggered a lot of different thoughts in my head, but perhaps one thing that I think that relates a lot to the issue of soft-feminism, that it's very connected to the area we work, is I think it would be a parallel to the pinkwashing, right? Like how we at the queer movement, we have to face this very strongly, like how you can't have a soft LGBTI approach. You cannot be left or right being used as a way to have a good reputation in the international sphere while you're violating the rights of this community and much other communities. So, and for that, I think that, first of all, accountability is the key, right? How do you bring these states and other institutions out of the rhetoric to really show them that if they want to call themselves feminists, they want to call themselves LGBTI champions or gender champions or whatever language they use, they really need to prove themselves across the board, right? How I think that I won't commit a mistake here saying that like voting in favor of resolution, for instance, on discrimination against women is as important voting against in favor of resolution on systemic racism and economic, social, cultural rights. And you cannot like pick and choose which rights you are going to defend and which you won't just because it's a political enemy that's putting forward. So I think that to hold this I mean, all states are accountable, right? Not only the ones that have feminist foreign policy, but the ones that really say that they are committed to it into a deep approach. It's the way, at least, that us as civil society can move forward with a bit more like playing our role as accountability holders.
Thank you, Gabriel and Katia.
Thank you, Paola. Lina, just a quick thought on your question and comment. I think what's really important, and I think the Global North feminists can learn a lot from our colleagues and comrades in the Global South, is that feminist debates also always need to be connected to a social debate on social and economic justice. We cannot look at the issue of gender justice separately, and I think our comrades in the Global South do a much better job at looking at these substantial issues. And that's why I mentioned in my input that I'm a wee bit frustrated that our FFP strategies do not look into the economic system and do not question the kind of environment that we live in and that we work in. And I think when we are engaging in debates about bringing more women to the table and where it's about numbers, and don't get me wrong, I'm a very big fan of quotas because we need to start somewhere. But when we're engaging in debates on bringing women to the table, we always need to raise the question, what kind of table do we want women to sit at, and in what kind of room is that table standing? And I think that's a way to highlight that we really need a transformative approach. But I think engaging in conversations is very important because women are unfortunately very good at kind of building frontiers in between them. And I'd rather try to overcome those with conversation and asking questions than doing exactly what the patriarchy wants us to do, is to build frontiers between each other.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions, so we're going to take them as a batch. We have a question coming from one participant online, so I'm just going to read it. I see that South Africa is on the list and perhaps the only African country. I'd like to know if during the research, so this is, I think, towards Foteini, there was a survey of African countries generally to see the disposition of their government towards feminist foreign policies. I'm from Nigeria, and I don't think there are conversations around this at all in the country. I would also like to know if there are contextual differences in how governments of countries that are adopting feminist foreign policies, so between governments adopting feminist foreign policies. And lastly, what is the role of local feminist organizations in facilitating the adoption of feminist foreign policies in their respective countries? Can a feminist foreign policy be initiated from local governments to federal governments, so from below to the top? So that's one set of questions. Thank you very much. This is coming from Nimisire, who is online. And then we have another question in the room. Two other questions in the room, and then we'll let our panelists answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for this great panelist and the keynote. And you mentioned that those that adopted the feminist foreign policy also look inwards, which is incredibly important. Personally, I believe that for a feminist foreign policy to be successful, that people who work in foreign policy, in the foreign offices and the embassies, need to engage with the concept and understand it for themselves and see what does it mean for my daily work. So I'm wondering what kind of internal discussions or trainings or forms of institutionalization beyond the mere guidelines are happening in the countries that adopted the feminist foreign policy. So addressing this question to those that did, but also to the civil society, let's say, observers. And then maybe as a second, maybe like open or also difficult question, I'm aware, is what Katia said in her input on pragmatism and the challenge or the dissonance between pragmatism and feminist foreign policy. And I think we all know that countries will not give up their pragmatism or, let's say, their economic interests overnight, but like how do you communicate it and where do you strike the balance?
And my question was towards Alondra. You spoke about the dialogue you engage with civil society to ensure really between the design of a foreign policy plan and the needs on the ground. So I would like to, if you could elaborate a bit more on how was that undertaken, and also how was it received from the civil society?
In Europe, some argue that the delivery of weapons to Ukraine fits into a feminist foreign policy framework, as Russia is systematically using sexual violence as a mean of war. Is this a singular European view to justify the export of weapons to Ukraine, or is there a broader global consensus that also the exportation of weapons can fit into a feminist foreign policy?
Okay, so to summarize, I think we have some questions that are parallel to each other, and that's really the question between development and implementation of feminist foreign policies vis-à-vis relationship with feminist movements and activists and local feminist groups. And then we have another question particularly on, well, the delivery of weapons to Ukraine as part or not of a feminist foreign policy. And we also had questions around the specific context of Africa and if there has been any type of research that has been made in assessing where the governments are at. So I am going maybe to change the order, not to put the same person on the spot at the same time. So maybe starting online with Foteini and then Katia.
Regarding the African context, there is a lot of discussion and debate happening already around what feminist foreign policy could mean, both as it is implemented in Africa and what it could mean coming from Africa. South Africa is indeed the only country in the data set as an OECD, adjacent to OECD, but there hasn't been an analysis yet of other countries on the continent. That would be very interesting to see. And we, personally, I always say I would love to see more policies come from developing countries or from the global South, not the big donor countries that do not try to faithfully follow what has already been done, but think a little bit more creatively and radically about what does this space need to progress, to keep progressing. Around coherence, of course, we want to see coherence between domestic and international policies. We want to see the same level of commitments, but that also ties into how to strike the balance between the rhetoric and the commitments and then the actual economic and business interests. I think there's a tension there between not being able to have the FFP adopted coherently from all levers of the government. We do want to see that coherence expand across government entities. At the same time, we do see that when it tends to be a little siloed in the foreign service, it is kind of shielded from the debates that are happening in everyday politics and can continue making progress, especially in international forums, that could have been, a little bit at risk if it was more open to internal debates around feminism and gender equality. On Ukraine and arms exports, it is a complicated issue. Then, some say that no, FFP does not necessarily need to be pacifist. Others challenge that. I would like to point out that many partners from the global South highlight that, when conflicts are in Africa, for example, or the Middle East, the dominant narrative from global North countries tends to be there is no military solution to your conflicts. The only solution is the peace table. Not to say that this is what should happen in Ukraine or is feasible in Ukraine, but there tends to be a lack of coherence in narratives depending on where the conflict is. And that is something that global North and FFP countries, I think, need to be cognizant of and thinking about in their approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Katia.
Thank you, Paola. The question on feminism and arms delivery or weapon delivery, it's a very contested question and very discussed question in I can only speak for Germany at this stage because I'm not following closely the discussion in other countries. But to say the least, it's very difficult to answer, and there is no simple yes or no answer. Even among the feminist community, be it experts or activists in Germany, there is no agreement. So I'm just trying to kind of gather the discussion that we're having by starting with saying that I'm struggling with finding a like 100% yes or no answer, simply because I don't live in the Ukraine. I'm safely in Berlin, having a wonderful time. Who am I to tell Ukrainian men or women or families not to save their lives? I think that's very easily judged from the comfort of your safe home, but it's a very different situation when you're on the ground. And I believe that it's feminist to speak to your partners, to ask them who are the people who are in the situation, what their needs are. And we're hearing from a lot of our feminist partners that they are in favor of weapon deliveries to defend themselves. And I think we need to look at, I know this is a dilemma, but I think we need to look at in feminist foreign policy measures in the short term and the long term perspective. I believe that in the short run, in the face of violence and when human life is a threat, I think the Ukrainian people need to have the opportunity to defend themselves. What should they do? They didn't start that conflict, and I don't think that they can kindly just negotiate and say, please, don't take my house, let me live. I don't think that's how it works. And if we are on the global level struggle to find a diplomatic solution, how is the ordinary Ukrainian family supposed to find a solution on the ground? However, in the long run, our feminist foreign policy should always be putting human rights at the center. Feminism should always be the core of our action. Pacifism, or trying to achieve pacifism, should always be the core of the doing in the long run, in the long-term feminist strategy. Of course, arms control and preventing war is another thing or another aim that feminist foreign policy should achieve in the long run. But in the short term, I think if we want to save human lives, then these actions can be, even in the name of feminism, be justified. Because as a feminist, I don't want to be responsible for the situation that someone is hurt or killed because we didn't help. That's partly my opinion. That's partly the answer that a lot of German feminists give you. You'll of course have completely different answers from other people, but that's the debate that's going on here.
I think I would take just a point on the question on pragmatism and how do we balance that and economic interests. I think that is our daily conflict, especially when you deal with like multilateral negotiations. Of course, I think that what we need to avoid is to have our issues instrumentalized and being used as bargain chips, which has been a trend, of course. But I do think that as civil society, we do have the liberty to push for our issues to be promoted, and at the same time demand accountability and demand that, for instance, when we talk about arms trades, we're also talking about economic interests, and to be there saying that this is not, in our conception, this is not feminist, that we need to stop that, or we need to not be trading votes on one resolution by other bilateral agreements on investment and so on. So I do think that as civil society, it might be a bit easier for us to sit here because we can be there and demand these different posture from states, but it is not easy most of times when you are dealing on these diplomatic spaces.
And last but not least, Alondra.
Thank you, Paola. I will start with the question on local governments. I think in Mexico's experience, it has been like two ways. The federal government has done its part when it comes to foreign policy, but the main progress made like in real changes in the legal framework and administrative framework have mainly come from the local government. So when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also protecting and respecting rights of LGBTI persons, this has come from local governments mainly. So it is very important that we also have a dialogue not only between different levels of government, but also branches of governments, like engaging also with the judiciary and with the Congress to exchange this kind of information, and also among agencies, because as we were saying, most of the things we promote at the multilateral level have to do with very technical issues to be implemented at the national level, so we really need to have an open communication with different agencies to make it real. And when it comes to the question on civil society and how do we explain what we are trying to achieve with the language and concepts we are using, I think the main example I have as first-hand information is the experience we have with resolutions. So this is like just the text that it's like a lot of commitments and calls for action, but you really need to understand what's behind that. So what we do is actually engage with civil society organizations to know what's really going on the ground, what are the main challenges. Last year we had a briefing involving also, like as we were speaking of women, young women and girls' participation, then we brought them to the table. So we were hearing directly from them to understand what was going on, what were their interests in different areas like climate change, but also sexual and reproductive health and rights, and hearing from it their experience and gathering like different states with different perspectives helps us all understand what we were doing. Also what we did last time was like trying to develop kind of a glossary of all the concepts we were using to be able to explain, like first to have it very clear when we were doing it, and also explain to other stakeholders taking part of the conversation what we meant by something. This is the only way we can do it. It's not only, like, it has been also very useful to talk to UN Women, but also to UNFPA and also to UNICEF, because they work on different areas. So these have like really make the conversation more comprehensive. And another important way of collaboration is that civil society organizations usually are like close to activists in each and every country. So they bring them close to the multilateral scenario and conversations where we have the opportunity to exchange views and really understand what's going on.
Thank you so much. I see that there are more comments online, but we're already past the time, so I'm happy to put the participants online in touch with the panelists that can answer their questions. And now I'm handing back the floor to Lina for the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, I just want to clarify where are we heading after that. But first of all, let me thank Paola for putting together such an amazing panel. And could you reassure your panelists that they're not through with us, that this is just the beginning? So, yeah, they know. Okay, good. So there are kind of two connected strands that we will be working on. On the one hand, there's the effort that Paola is leading, which is basically translating what this means on the ground. How can it become usable? How can it become also a tool against all forms of backlash, anti-rights movement, but also the incredibly unpleasant soft feminist movement. So how do we translate this? How does it become usable? And then also the effort, it's not even a parallel effort, it's a connected effort that my colleague Vanessa is leading with our friends from HBS and also from FES, which is about more into creating these connections and facilitate, correct me if I'm wrong, Vanessa, facilitating an engagement between civil society and those who have already a feminist policy, countries in the process of actually developing their. How do we engage? How do we facilitate this engagement? And how do we bring intersectional feminist voices to processes of formulating feminist policies? And also in terms of the work that Foteini is doing, again, it made me think, and thank you for the presentation, Foteini, made me think, again, how do we appropriate, how do we think practically about how do we measure, how do we monitor, how do we hold different stakeholders accountable? And in that's way beyond the 2 minutes I promised. Thank you all for being with us. And as usual, this is a wrap-up of yet another, I'm not known for being modest, yet another amazing conversation at the Asfari Institute, an amazing feminist, seriously feminist conversation, no dilution here. And watch this space. We will be continuing. Thank you for the amazing team, Carla. And each and every one of the panelists, thank you for being with us. Foteini, Kate, Gabi, and Alondra, again, you're not through. We're good stalkers, so see you next time. Thank you, everybody.